I do hope you can see me today from where you are.
Ich bin ein Feeling.
If I'm generally anything, I guess I'm generally miserable. This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women.
The people, I would say, there is no patent. Would you patent the sun?
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
Welcome to the Biographers.
Oh boy. Okay.
Pip, pip, pop, pip, 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 pop, pip, pip, boop, pip.
Deep breaths.
We have the high desert oxygen that is less oxygen than
Normal oxygen.
even though we even live at altitude.
In Denver oxygen, which is no
Yes.
good.
So we're like so acclimated. Man, we should do like a biographers series on like a pirate so that we're at sea level. And then we would be like really able to talk without getting out of breath.
This is true. And for everybody that is immediately joining us right now, we are coming to you live, by the way, I should say, from Mabel Dodge Luhan's house.
Is it
in
live?
New Mexico. I guess it's not live. It's live when we're recording it, not
It's
live when you're listening to it.
Recorded on site
Recorded on site.
at Mabel's house.
Oh, I can't have gum? Is that too disgusting for you?
I can't have gum while it...
Okay, I have loose
There's
tissue.
there's tissue back there.
It can go
Folks,
We'll start over.
We'll try again.
Well, it's okay.
Because I could talk about not liking sticky things and explain what just happened.
Oh,
but
gosh.
it's fine.
Well, here we are.
Here we are.
I feel like I'm personally catching my breath right now because I feel like I've been running around all day and then running around all right now to get our recording equipment into this little room that we're in right now to record the final episode of our Mabel Dodge Luhan series.
And we are at the top of her house.
We are. Well, I should say, first of all, before we get into anything else, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Biographers once again. I also want to say welcome, Biographiles, because that's what I want to call all of you people that are interested in biographies. It's. I love this term. If you hate it, let me know, but I think Biographiles is sweet.
I think it's wonderful, you Biographiles.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. And as Aubrey was just saying, we are coming to you from location at Mabel Dodge Luhan's house in Taos, New Mexico. We are currently in the solarium, the highest room of her house. It's where I'm going to be sleeping tonight with my wife. You're going to be downstairs with your hubby in the Ansel Adams room, which is pretty awesome, right?
Yes, it's pretty awesome.
Super cool. So yeah, we've been... Aubrey, what have you done today?
Oh, let's see. We woke up. We stayed in a different location last night, and we had a wonderful breakfast at our bed and breakfast.
We did. Oh, yes. I told, was it Joe, I think his name was, that I would give him a shout out for anybody that listens to this series and decides, hey, I want to go down to Taos, New Mexico as well. That sounds like a hoot. I am going to go ahead and recommend that you stay at the Casa Benavides because it is not only beautiful, it was lovely, lovely rooms, but we had a really delicious breakfast as well. It was just a lovely experience all around. Highly recommend.
And then, luckily, my friends Daniel and Kat, they've been taking us on a little tourism tour of Taos. Tourism tours of Taos. We went to the Rio Grande Gorge.
We did. Where Mabel came up from with Tony for the first time when they were first coming to Taos from Santa Fe.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And if you ever go there, you'll see that was a feat because it's a deep gorge.
It is. I don't love heights, and my knees buckle when I go over the top of this bridge.
Those of you who like a little thrill when you're on the bridge and a truck drives over, it definitely vibrates. So if that's a thing you don't like.
It sways when a fast car goes over this bridge, and you can feel the cement under you kind of like tremble, and I am not into that feeling whatsoever. What else did we do?
Well, we went shopping. There were some people, some vendors, some little artisans.
There were.
They were along over by the gorge, and I bought a necklace, and Kat got
I bought her a necklace.
Well, and I bought a necklace with the money that my husband gave me in the morning.
What is today for you?
Today is our 1-year wedding anniversary.
Yay!
And he is willing to take a break for 2 hours so I can do this podcast.
Yes. So everybody, this is sacrifice
This is
for you.
Serious sacrifice.
This is her. She should be with her husband right now, which we were just saying when we were having lunch earlier today. It does not feel like it was a year ago that we were all dancing and partying together at your wedding. But here we are a year later. And time flies when you're having fun, I guess.
Yep. And then we went to the Taos Pueblo.
We did indeed.
Which has been mentioned and will continue to be mentioned in this podcast.
We'll continue.
A wonderful place to visit. Amazing people. Just gorgeous art and pottery and bows and arrows, like artisan handmade items there, history, wonderful dogs running around.
Many dogs running around
My
that
dog-
we're not supposed to touch, but we did pet one.
No,
'cause it
we
was just
didn't.
so sweet.
Don't.
No, that's true. We didn't. I lied. It's not true. We didn't pet any dogs.
My dogs would be very happy if they lived there, just running around and playing and rolling in the dirt. Yeah, and then just to make, I want to turn my head, but this microphone is directional, so I can't turn while I'm saying this. But if I were an owl and were able to turn my head almost all the way around, we have a basically 360 view of the mountains and the valley and Taos and everything from this room. So if you do ever come to Taos, another place you could stay and
You can
should
stay at Mabel's
stay
house.
is at Mabel's house. And if you book the solarium, it is like being in a sunny birdhouse.
Which you might, by the way. We have the windows open right now in this room. It is, just as Aubrey said, 360 degrees of glass windows that you get to stay in here. It's really, really beautiful, which means it does also get a little toasty. So we have the windows open. You might hear a bird in the background. There's also, just at the park, just like about a mile away, not even half a mile away from here, there's a little festival going on. So you might hear a little mariachi music or something like that occasionally. I think our mics might drown it out. But anyways,
sure.
Yeah, if you hear a little bit of background, hey, that's just welcome to Taos. This is what happens here. People have fun and they have festivals and they play live music and it's super cool. It's just a great little place to be.
It is the experience, the Taos experience.
Oh, I should also tell all of the listeners that are out there, this past week I've had bronchitis. I might be coughing just a teeny bit more than usual, or my voice might sound just a little bit funny, but I refused to say we're not going to record when we're down here because we've been planning this for weeks now. So
yes.
We will get through this come hell or high water, but just wanted to let all y'all know if my voice sounds a little funny or if I have to pause occasionally to hack up a lung or something. I'm going to do my best post-production to edit as much of that out as I can because I just can't imagine you want to hear me coughing out there, but just letting y'all know, I do apologize. A couple other little fun facties of where we are. I will get to a couple more later about just some of the house things that we're in that are, coming up or whatever. But I was just telling Aubrey as well, behind me, you can see it better than I can. There's this big, gigantic open field, basically. And if our listeners have been following along in this series, you'll remember from, I believe it was episode 3 of this series, when Mabel first gets to Taos, she gets really interested in the Mexican penitentes, and they sneak out into the desert, and they supposedly witness these kind of religious devotees, I guess is the nice way to say it, who would I guess flog themselves, kind of a thing. And so out in that field where we're looking at, that was literally where she snuck out into, and we can literally see across where the little chapel is of where they would go out into the desert and do those things. So kind of interesting.
Without having to use my owl neck, I can see it from where I sit.
It's beautiful. Well, all right. You ready to get into our conclusion to old Mabel Dodge here? It feels like it's the end of an era.
I know. I've been waiting, and I'm so excited to know.
So I will tell everyone here, this is even going to be a little bit longer. This is about of my normal scripts that I do. This is about a page longer from what I'm normally used to. Truth be told, I probably could have spent another 3 or 4 pages, if not 5, writing about Mabel. To be honest with you, though, a lot of these other details in her later portions of life, although they are interesting, they're not quite, in my personal opinion, as interesting as the stuff that I chose to cover in this episode. So I really did try to do my best in selecting what I feel like are the most important parts of this. What I might do in the future, maybe in like 6 months or something, I might do like a little extra credit episode on Mabel Dodge, where we just cover some of like a couple little stories we didn't cover that were kind of fun. So for anybody here that's like a diehard Mabel Dodge fan for some reason, if there's something that I leave out and you're like, hey, that was pretty darn important, we might come back to it. So give us some time.
I mean, the other thing too is Daniel's done extensive research on Mabel Dodge, so you get to listen, you get to hear us I don't know, say what we say and have our commentary. So there's a little bit more than just reading a book. But there's a lot of writings on Mabel Dodge, many biographies and autobiography sorts of things. So the good news is if you're like, wow, I want to learn more, we haven't told you every single thing either. So we're here to always promote anybody that has been doing research and people who continue to do more. So anyway, here we go.
I will also say that in the little office downstairs where we checked in for at Mabel's house here, it is just filled with books specifically about Mabel or books that were written by Mabel
and other artists that she encountered too. So
or brought to this house.
Yeah, basically anybody who was Mabel adjacent.
Mabel adjacent. So definitely a lot more. Like the thing that's really interesting about all of this is there's just so much to learn in life. Yeah.
And so many things to know, and just there's so much more. You may hear a story or read something that's a little snippet or see a short TikTok or something like that, and it might be an interesting fact. And like there's just the world is so vast and history is so deep and people's lives are so complex and long, and anyway, it's just interesting. So
along those lines, though, you and I were kind of talking about this as well, is that, so I've already started research into my next series that I'm doing. I'm not going to say who it is yet, but I've already found connections to Mabel in this person that I'm researching.
And to the person I am researching for my next.
Yes.
So it's crazy.
I think it was you who said it. You said it's, I was kind of nerding out going, oh, it's like all these like people, like their lives have touched. And you just said simply, the world is not as big as we think.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh my gosh, that's the best way to say it. And like, it's so small in these ways, and that people have touched their lives. Even in, literally when we were just out at the Taos Pueblo, in episode 3, I made mention of a gentleman named Red Sunrise who made a bow and arrow that I bought from him this past Christmas. He was there again when we went to the Taos Pueblo, so I obviously had to go say hey, thank him again for the lovely bow and arrow that I love every single day that I look in my office or downstairs in my little basement. And he and I got to talking. Turns out he is actually the great nephew of Tony Luhan, and the home that he lives in, the literal house that we got to walk
standing
into
in front of, where he had a table out because it was such a beautiful day. He brought some of his wares out instead of just sitting inside.
And that actual house where he lives in and made all of this stuff, it is the house where Mabel first met Tony and Calendaria. That story that we told when he was banging the drum and he said, I've seen you in my dreams. Literally, when we were talking to him, he goes, oh, yeah, Tony dreamed about her.
Yes, and the other man, Richard. He said,
it was Richard. Oh, Red Sunrise said his last name. It was Aspen Air. It was something like that. I apologize, but it was
Richard,
something very close.
If you're listening, we're sorry we didn't get your last name. But he was saying, too, that Mabel had dreamed of Tony and Tony had dreamed of her. Yes. So, I mean, it was really humbling. We're just like some people that were like, let's learn about someone. And then coming to find these people here that are like actual descendants of the people that we're talking, and not far away.
And literally, like he taught us something, which was that when Tony married Mabel, his last name was spelled Lujan.
Yes.
And when Mabel took Tony to New York, nobody could pronounce his last name. They would say Lujan. So Mabel took it upon herself when she married him to change her last name to Luhan, and Tony followed suit. So did his ancestors. So Red Sunrise, his last name is Luhan, Luhan, which is just so darn cool. I couldn't get over it. I was beaming.
Folks, if you had been there, like Daniel was just like if you could see an aura or something, he was just like colors and excitement, and like sparks were practically coming out of him. He was so excited.
I don't know, when you're a part of history like that, when you experience something like that, where I mean, especially when I feel like I've learned so much about these people. I've spent so much time learning about these people, to then go and be like, oh my gosh, here I am talking to your great grandnephew. I am literally walking into the house where you met this person that I have just spent 9 hours talking about and how many hours researching. I'm literally in this space and I'm learning these new things about these people that I didn't know. I don't know how you can't just get jazzed about that kind of
jazz,
stuff.
Chills, excitement. I don't even know. Well, and okay, one last thing, and we should get into it, but There's also something that's a little bit of almost like celebrity. When you read about someone who's notable enough to have biographies written about them and be talked about, and then being able to just like randomly walk up to someone who like knew the person or is related to, it's just kind of interesting how close people are. I don't know. Again, the world is small.
And it was also... I had to ask, by the way, when I was at the Pueblo, I said, I kind of explained that we were in town because we're doing this podcast all about Mabel. And I said to Red Sunrise, I said, can I ask you, like, in regards to Mabel Dodge, is she generally seen by the tribal people as a positive figure, as like a generally, like well accepted figure? And he said, oh yeah, she really did a lot. He said obviously there was, a couple of little
mixed
things that were like, some people are gonna be like, well, she was kind of like meh sometimes.
Yeah, it was a little mixed, but
he said that
overall,
generally it is favorable and that she really did do a lot to get a lot of their land back to them. So it was just a nice thing as well to see that, like, I hate to say it, but it's not just some white lady coming to town and being like, I did things, but then the real people of town are like, no, she didn't. In fact, I do believe she really did. And I do think that the people of this area and the tribes of this area...
Everyone knows who she is.
Not only know who she is, but it was really cool to hear them say, no, we did appreciate what she did as well.
She did good things.
And she did good things, exactly. So... okay, enough fun. We've been in Taos stuff. Let's actually dive into our content. So everyone, again, thanks for joining us in this journey with Mabel Dodge. Let's get into the conclusion of Mabel Dodge Luhan's life. So last time, we found Mabel living in Taos, New Mexico, obviously, and separating from Maurice Stern, who had moved back to New York in August of 1919. After her separation with Maurice Stern, Mabel traveled back to New York separately, and there she met with an occultist named Mrs. Lotus Dudley, who charged Mabel with the task of bringing all the great souls to Taos and preserve the way of the Pueblo people, who currently held the knowledge to obtain nirvana on Earth. Mabel had also begun a romance with Tony Luhan, a full-blooded member of the Tiwa tribe of the Taos Pueblo. We ended the last episode with the teaser that Mabel was trying to get the attention of D.H. Lawrence, which would now bring us to September of 1921, and Mabel being 42 years old. Also, really quickly, before we start, in the last few episodes, we were talking a good bit about Mabel's first landlord, Arthur Manby, and I occasionally said Mansby. It is indeed Manby, no S. So I just wanted to throw that out there real quick in case anybody does some Googling and goes, there is no Arthur Mansby. I was wrong.
Also, sidebar, we
Yes.
saw his grave,
We
his
did.
alleged grave.
His alleged grave. And it was actually funny because when we were sitting there, we were having a chat about it and whatever. We were telling Aaron and Kat, like, oh yeah, this is kind of the story of Arthur Manby. A local walks by and goes, oh yeah, no, that's him. And I said, well, allegedly. And he goes, no, I've heard that's him.
He's like, it's him.
So I think we were the lame tourists in that regard. He
little
was like,
bit.
guys, come on, like that's him, So,
Guys,
I
quit
don't know.
gushing.
All right, now, if you still don't know who D.H. Lawrence is, you might just know his most famous novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was published privately in 1928 and publicly in 1929. If you don't know what Lady Chatterley's Lover is, it was a novel that, when published in 1929, was banned in the United States, Australia, Japan, Canada, India, and Great Britain. The nature of the book, much like D.H. Lawrence's work as a whole, dealt with sexual themes, oftentimes taboo, to say the least for the time. D.H. Lawrence, or David Herbert Lawrence, was a novelist, poet, playwright, essayist, and modernist whose writings were the source of such controversy that they would still be actively debated throughout the 1900s, even being taken to British High Court during his life, as well as more than 30 years after his death, and continue to be discussed to this day.
Okay, so the country that has the Kama Sutra thought it was a little too spicy.
Oh, yes. And also a lot of that, like, kind of, I'm not good with this kind of phase of British law, but it was a lot of like similarities with American laws of like decency laws of like what is acceptable. So there were a lot of like book burnings that happened in the UK. And I actually think I'm about to talk about that as well. Now, originally born in Nottinghamshire, England in 1885, Lawrence showed early promise for writing in receiving a scholarship to Nottingham High School at age 14. In 1910, his first novel was published, titled The White Peacock, receiving generally positive reviews, but shortly after this, his mother, Lydia Beardsall, passed away, which led to him writing his first breakthrough hit and revered masterpiece, Sons and Lovers, which would be published in 1913. In 1912, Lawrence met his one-day-to-be wife, Frieda Weekly, with whom he would spend the rest of his life, and who is also a fascinating character in her own right. When Lawrence first met Frieda, she was already married with 3 children, and her husband was actually Lawrence's modern languages professor at the University College in Nottingham. Pretty scandalous. The two eloped, leaving England and staying with Frieda's parents in Metz, France. Metz, by the way, has a complicated history in that it was considered a garrison town, which really means it was a military outpost. I didn't know that. The town had a history of speaking both French and German, as it was on the border of the two countries, and due to military conflict, went back and forth in possession from Germany to France to Germany to France to Germany, and then ultimately back to France in 1944. Frieda Lawrence identified as German and spoke with a German accent. Just wanted to note that, as that is a part of her character and personality.
Okay, all of that is very interesting. But also, there's a hummingbird flying around outside of the window.
Is there really?
Uh-huh. And I think he went away, but also I can't stop thinking about where we are. Maybe we should never do this again because I'm too distracted by the location. It's too fun. But there are all these birdhouses, like hundreds of birdhouses here. So there's birds everywhere anyway. But I did kind of do a little dance while we were learning about Metz going back and forth in countries' ownership.
Like, what's she looking at?
What is she looking at? It's a hummingbird. Like, I've never seen a hummingbird before, but it's exciting. Okay.
I love hummingbirds. I'm gonna have to do that a fair amount. Boy. Okay. Now, by 1914, Frieda had obtained a divorce, the two had moved back to England, and in 1915, Lawrence published The Rainbow, which caused another massive wave of controversy, especially in England, which ended up being banned in high court due to obscenity, and over 1,000 copies were seized and burned.
Okay.
Due to this harassment by the government, Lawrence and Frieda left England altogether and went on a sort of pilgrimage over the next few years, traveling to Italy, Australia, the United States, Mexico, Sri Lanka, and the south of France. Through this traveling extravaganza, Lawrence started to form the notion in his head that he wanted to start up a utopian commune of sorts, occupied mostly by artists, the philosophy of which I don't really understand, but it seemed to have a lot to do with free love. By the time Mabel caught up with him, it was September of 1921, and Lawrence and Frieda were in Taormina, Sicily. Before she engaged with D.H. Lawrence, Mabel had already been writing to many of her friends to have them come stay for extended visits in Taos, like the previously mentioned John Collier, but also folks like Leo Stein, Willa Cather, Arthur Brisbane, Mary Austin, Marsden Hatley, the Hapgoods, who we talked a lot about, and Andrew Dasburg, whose presence in Taos would change the art of the Southwest forever. But after she had read Lawrence's novel, Sons and Lovers, and an essay entitled Psychoanalysis and the Unconscious, Mabel became convinced that Lawrence was the only one who possessed both the mind and spirit to truly educate Western civilization on the life of the Pueblo people. Mabel's initial letter to Lawrence and Frieda was so long that it needed to be scrolled on a lengthy piece of papyrus parchment and wound up tightly.
Okay.
Along with this letter, Mabel included a sprinkle of perfumed herb used by the tribespeople known as desache, and another herb called osha, which was said to be a strong medicine. Mabel also claims to have sent a handmade necklace to Frieda that supposedly had some, quote, Indian magic to it, but Frieda never did receive a necklace, and Mabel was prone to ignoring the topic if it was ever brought up again.
Okay.
Like, Mabel, I never did get that necklace that you said you sent with the Native Americans. I don't know what you're talking about, Frieda. necklace? What? Anyways, what's over here?
Good German accent.
I tried.
Were you waiting? Were you waiting to do that?
I've literally been practicing as I've been going through the script and writing it all out. When I would get to a moment with Frieda Lawrence, I'd be like, "Oh yeah, that sounds very good."
I'm not so sure I'll be doing any accents for my part.
It's okay. Even if you just try, I think it'd be fun.
Well, that'd be fun to make fun of me.
Exactly.
Okay, let's go.
I'll do it. Now, Mabel received Lawrence's response on November 5th, 1921, first with him thanking her for the gifts and letter. He mentions having heard of Taos before, having seen a photograph hanging in Leo Stein's apartment, obviously, and that he would be quite keen to come visit to see what the place was all about. There were a number of letters that went back and forth between them over the course of several months, with Lawrence asking questions and Mabel continuing to lay the persuasion on thick. All along the way, Lawrence was doing his due diligence in writing to various friends and colleagues to see if Mabel was a person that he should trust or even spend time around. Leo Stein, of course, recommended her with enthusiasm. However, Mabel was too smart for that and had written Leo first, asking that he say good things about her to Lawrence so that he might be more prone to visiting Taos.
Oh, she's crafty.
She's a crafty one. More than just trying to get Lawrence out to Taos to write about it, it also seems that Mabel had begun to develop something of a crush on Lawrence that would only continue to grow over time.
Of course, Mabel.
Of course, she's got a thing for everyone, right?
Yep, she loves everyone.
Such was her obsession with bringing Lawrence to Taos that she would lay awake at night trying to will the spirit world to bring him to her, calling out into the darkness, "Come, Lawrence, come to Taos." However, despite her best efforts to draw in D.H. Lawrence in the form of lengthy letters, steamy poetry, magic chants, and sweet-scented herbs, Lawrence would continue to push off the invitation to Taos for a full year, traveling through India before finally arriving in San Francisco and catching a train to Taos. It was September of 1922. Quick aside, D.H. Lawrence was also called Lorenzo by his close friends, including Mabel, hence the title of her book some years later, Lorenzo in Taos. And for the most part moving forward, I'll be referring to D.H. Lawrence as Lorenzo. The reason I'm doing that, by the way, is because he has Frieda as well, and it's Frieda Lawrence. So it's, I don't know, for me it just felt weird to be like, oh, there's Lawrence and then there's Frieda when she's a Lawrence too. So I'm calling him Lorenzo because I think it's also fun.
Okay.
Now, Tony and Mabel picked up the Lawrences at the train station, but due to the car breaking down once again, the four ended up staying the night in Santa Fe at the house of Mabel's friend, poet Witter Binner. Witter Binner had been living in Santa Fe for some time with his secretary and lover, Spud Johnson, and was delighted to welcome such a literary icon to his and Spud's home. And by the way, for all of my baseball history fans out there, no, not the baseball player Spud Johnson. That is James Ralph Johnson. This is Walter Willard Johnson, who are both nicknamed Spud. Just thought I'd throw that out there. But yes, Witter Binner was gay, and Spud Johnson was also gay, obviously, and they were together. And actually, later on, I don't really get into it much, but way later on, Mabel actually kind of pulled Spud Johnson away from Witter Binner, and they kind of had a feud from that point on, because Witter was so, like, mad with her. He was like, you took away my man. So, I know.
Mabel.
But it was more like, it wasn't because she was, like, trying to like romantically pull him in. She was more just like, hey, Spud, stay with me. You can write here. You can do whatever and be my assistant and all that kind of stuff.
Looking around, I can see how it would be a good temptation.
Come on. This place is just gorgeous.
I could probably write the next great American novel if I were able to just hang out here.
Right? This is just a beautiful place. Now, this visit with Witter and Spud seemed to have given Mabel her first true impression as to the nature of Frieda and Lorenzo's relationship. After meeting Witter and Spud, Frieda pulled Mabel into a bedroom and once they were alone said, "The young one. This one seems rather nice. Un ménage, hein?" Once again, slang and lingo for the time might be lost on me, as technically, ménage translates to household in French. So it could translate to a household, yes? However, it does seem to mean exactly what you think it means, as Mabel was quite appalled at the proposition. Yes. The next day, when the group finally arrived at Mabel's big house, Los Gallos, which is the house that we are currently at right now, she also got her first taste of Lorenzo's true nature, as he almost immediately began to criticize her interior decor, saying, quote, "It's like one of those nasty little temples in India.
Well, I mean, if it's anything like it was then today, I'm definitely digging the vibe.
D.H. Lawrence, oh boy.
There's a lot of like Oriental rugs and
to be fair, when he first got here, this was when Mabel still had a huge collection of like Italian Renaissance furniture.
so she could be making it a little gaudy out
She
here.
was. Yes. And basically what happened was from this point on, she started to go, ooh, maybe I can like sell off like chunks of these things because he's kind of right. Like, we're going to see this a lot. So like D.H. Lawrence, first of all, I don't think I can say that I like. Obviously it's complicated. There's a lot of things there, but like ultimately at the end of the day, from what I've learned about the guy, he did not seem like a very kind or very cool dude in a lot of ways, but somehow he just had a magnetic energy around him that people just could not get away from him. They loved being around him, despite him doing this kind of stuff all the time. And we're going to see other examples of his flaws, let's just say. And also, actually, one thing I do want to mention, I didn't actually write it into this. I told you earlier I wanted to say, remind
Ask
me to bring
about
up
the
the
windows.
windows. Okay. So when D.H. Lawrence first got here, for anybody that decides to Google the Mabel Dodge Luhan house, you're going to see on the second floor, there are these windows that are painted in these really beautiful, vibrant colors and these kind of just patterns, right? What happened was when D.H. Lawrence first got here, Mabel said, hey, you can stay in this room. This was Tony's room, but you can stay here with Frieda. And she said, and this is your bathroom. And he looked in the bathroom and it had all these windows all over the place. And he was so embarrassed because he thought people would spy on him when he was trying to go to the bathroom that D.H. Lawrence painted all of those windows.
Oh,
And
okay.
they're still there to this day. So if we were able to actually stay in Tony's room, we would have been able to use the restroom that D.H. Lawrence painted the windows of.
Well, we can see the windows, but not anybody taking a potty break.
Not a potty break.
No potty breaks.
Now, this type of behavior and attitude, Mabel would soon discover, was a regular occurrence for Lorenzo. But it didn't seem to matter much, as the two hit it off immediately, and Mabel described the feeling that the two were, quote, of one blood. Mabel had begun to make firm plans that Lorenzo was now the object of her desire. See, right around this time, Mabel had been going through a completely normal thing that most all women go through, called menopause. With this change, Mabel began to believe that she had gained a new sexual power, and she believed that she could give this power to others through consummation.
Like the opposite of a succubus or something?
Yeah. She's like turning herself around. Oh, I never even thought about that. That's totally true. That's exactly what it is. It's like, I'm going to give you this whatever power. Lorenzo's sexuality was complicated, and he was, at the very least, bisexual, quite possibly homosexual. Either way, he was, I don't want to say necessarily very open, but he was pretty darn open with his sexual just escapades in general. Not only did he write a lot about them, but it seemed that he and Frieda had a fairly open relationship with that sort of a thing.
Okay, so open about sexuality, but not about pooping.
Yes, and you're going to see these really, really strange things about D.H. Lawrence that I cannot reconcile, where, like, he is so modest in the weirdest, most traditional ways, and then so modern in the opposite ways. Okay. You know what I mean? It's a very strange contradiction, seemingly, with him, but we're going to learn a lot more about that. Now, I do understand there are shades of gray here, so I'm not trying to put anyone in a box, but it does seem that Lorenzo had heavy leanings in his favors towards men. However, this topic and D.H. Lawrence's complicated and nuanced life could be the subject of its own deep dive series. Who knows? Maybe we'll get there one day. I say this because despite Mabel's best and most consistent attempts over the years to get Lorenzo into bed, he never did take her up on the offer. He did, however, have affairs with other men, and occasionally women, but those encounters seem to be more for Frieda's sake. Again, it's complicated. That's all I'm going to tell y'all, okay? If you really want to dive into this relationship between Frieda and D.H. Lawrence, I'm telling you, it is its own completely complicated mess that we're just not going to have time for this podcast. Even more, regardless of all of that information, the biggest thing that Mabel did not count on was Lorenzo's fierce devotion to Frieda and Frieda's fierce devotion to Lorenzo. Within a week of the Lawrences arriving at Los Gallos, Mabel shipped Lorenzo off to an annual Apache fiesta, which was taking place close to Tierra Amarilla, about 90 miles away, but kept Frieda back, as she said, to get to know her better. Just to note, Tony was voluntold by Mabel to be Lorenzo's chauffeur, much to Tony's disapproval and annoyance. Once Tony and Lorenzo had left, and Mabel and Frieda were alone, they finally got to talking and spent hours engaged in a deep, honest conversation. Frieda told Mabel that despite everyone else constantly talking about how wonderful Lorenzo was, he was actually quite the pain to live with and was near helpless on his own, not only in terms of daily living, but with his writing as well. She explained that during the process of writing Sons and Lovers, Frieda had to do quite a bit of the writing herself.
I've heard of that a lot.
Which I don't really talk about it much in my actual script here, but I do think that it's very interesting if you think about this for just a second. Basically what Frieda just told Mabel, and Mabel probably didn't even recognize, was, hey, a lot of the stuff that you read that you probably fell in love with,
I wrote it.
I wrote.
I mean, you hear that a lot with scientists and things like that too. Like lots of, I think even like the Wright brothers, there were some sisters.
I'm fairly confident Einstein's wife was also a big physicist and assisted a ton with his work and research. So
there are a lot of those things. So
Anyways, Frieda also talked openly and frankly about her sex life, and even further was joyfully proud of her contributions to the, quote, religion of love. According to Mabel, Frieda also shared that Lorenzo had been unfaithful to her, not once, but twice. With this conversation, Mabel seems to have developed both a love and a hate for Frieda, as they clearly got along well, but she felt extremely threatened by just how at home Frieda was in her own body. Even though Frieda would one day move to Taos permanently, where she and Mabel became good friends, she wrote a few years after their meeting and described Mabel and her pursuit of Lorenzo as, quote, a very energetic and powerful American woman who had learned all the tricks of the mind and the will, had decided that she was the person to run Lorenzo's genius, and he was the man to reveal to the world her great self. But there was no self to reveal. The very fact that she had no genuine self gave her the frantic desire to dominion over others. And I didn't read that in a German accent because I wanted to have it said clearly, you know, but it's a very interesting insight, you know. Now, once Lorenzo arrived back from the Apache fiesta with Tony, which he did not care for, he was immediately displeased to discover that Frieda and Mabel had become friends. Regardless of this, he excitedly pitched his new idea for a book to the pair, a novel about the life of Mabel Stern. Obviously, this delighted Mabel. I might even go so far as to say this might have been her intention from the very beginning, but that is speculation on my part. Mabel and Lorenzo agreed to start work on the book at once, planning to meet for breakfast the next morning for his first interview of her. Mabel, very much not having given up on her pursuit of Lorenzo, showed up to meet him on the rooftop terrace the next morning in a short, thin, flowing nightgown, moccasins, and nothing else.
Oh, Mabel.
Mabel, which, by the way, that terrace is just beneath you, under there.
Just beneath me.
Yeah, pretty cool, right over there. The two sat in silence for a few minutes before Lorenzo said, quote, I don't know how Frieda's going to feel about this. Mabel tried to brush it off by saying Frieda would understand, but Lorenzo was having none of it, and little came out of the interview. Oddly, Mabel wrote of the incident, of her conviction, that in this exchange, she and Lorenzo were physically intimate.
But I thought that they never were.
They weren't.
Okay, well.
Yeah, I don't get it. But that's what she wrote anyways. So, what are you going to do? I personally do not see how she arrived at this conclusion, as moving forward, Lorenzo would rarely, if ever, allow himself to be alone in the same room as Mabel. Nor did Frieda allow for the two to be alone together. In this, Lorenzo and Frieda seemed to be a united front. Again, a loyalty that Mabel did not count on. Additionally, Lorenzo insisted that any interviews be held between them moving forward would only be held over at Tony's house, which is where they were staying, as Mabel had built a house for Tony, and he had been staying there for quite a while. So she basically said, Tony, come stay with me, and now you can just go stay at their house. Because the two were always conducting interviews in Lawrence's abode, Frieda was a constant presence, always humming a song to herself in the background as she cleaned and worked. Mabel said later that, more than anything, Frieda's presence was the reason that Lorenzo eventually abandoned the project altogether, as she was never able to fully open up and talk to Lorenzo while Frieda was there.
I mean, was she just like cock-blocked?
I mean, I think it's probably a little more complicated than that, but she was definitely like, I don't know, I just see it as like Frieda and Lawrence had a conversation and they agreed, like, yeah, Mabel's after you, so like we can't let this happen.
Let's just make sure that somebody's here.
Yeah. Still, Mabel seems to ignore all the signs that Lorenzo is just not interested, and writes in her book, Lorenzo and Taos, quote, I wanted to secure his spirit so that I could make him carry out certain things. I did not want him particularly to touch him. There was no natural physical pleasure in contact with him. But I actually awakened in myself, artificially, I suppose, a willful wish to feel him, and I persuaded my flesh and my nerves that I wanted him. Mabel.
I feel like she's getting slightly more kooky.
Maybe. Again, in this endeavor, she failed, and nothing ever occurred between her and Lorenzo, but ever did she try. Lorenzo was always fairly blunt, if not vicious, in how he felt about nearly everything, and this included Mabel's wardrobe. Mabel felt that she had found a way to dress herself quite appropriately for her body type, and was honest, saying, quote, now, I have always been, if not fat, well, square. Though longing to be like a willow, I have always resembled a pine tree. Not the lofty kind, more the Christmas tree variety.
Oh, Mabel, I understand you.
I thought that was a great quote, too. On one particularly cruel occasion, Mabel had just received a new shipment of dresses she was particularly fond of, and upon trying on a dress that she felt was extra special, she rushed over to the Lawrences to do a bit of modeling. When he saw her, Lorenzo shouted, Sancta Maria! The jibbas! These Mother Hubbards!
Oh, no!
Jibbas, by the way, are a type of long, wide, tunic-like shirt that originated in the Sudan, are traditionally worn by Muslims, at least at the time, only by men. And Mother Hubbard? You'll just have to Google. Old Mother Hubbard is an English nursery rhyme from 1805, and if you see the original artwork for her, you'll understand why this is not a kind thing to say.
She went to her cupboard.
She looks like just like an old maid.
I
like
know. I read
maid.
Old Mother Hubbard. Or my mother read me Old Mother Hubbard.
What was the other one? What was the American one? The little lady lived in the shoe. What
There was an old woman who lived in the
Mother
shoe.
Goose. That's something of. Mother Goose.
Well, there also was Mother Goose. But yeah, there was an old woman who lived in the shoe.
But I feel like in the Mother Goose book was where the poem of the little lady lived in the shoe is in there.
Yeah.
Okay, anyways, whatever.
Probably.
After he said this to Mabel, he beckoned to Frieda, explaining that she was how a woman should look. Frieda was wearing a peasant skirt with a tightly cinched bodice, which emphasized her already impressive bust line. With this bit of abuse, Mabel dropped her style and began to dress in accordance with Lorenzo's standards. She even noticed that Frieda often wore aprons, even while not working, and Mabel soon discovered that Lorenzo's mother often wore aprons. And it was a turn-on for him.
Ew.
So, Mabel started wearing aprons. For one reason or another, it seemed that Mabel had finally encountered another person that would actually make her change, or at least pretend to. Frieda was very aware of Mabel's pursuits and wrote her a letter not long after her arrival in Taos saying, quote, You never cared a rap about me. You don't want a relationship with either me or Lawrence. You only want people in your power.
Well, that's about right.
We've seen that before. Also around this time, Mabel's son, John Evans, was in his first year at Yale University, but was starting to insist that he drop out so that he could come to Taos to marry Alice Henderson. Both Mabel and the Hendersons were opposed for several reasons, but mainly because Alice was just 15 years old.
I mean, I oppose as well.
Ditto. This seemed to be no matter to John, as the two were married before Christmas and moved onto a small piece of property in Taos that John owned called the Flying Heart. This seemed to cause something of a light bulb to go off in the head of Frieda and Lorenzo, and it seemed the two had grown tired of Mabel's constant attempts to woo Lorenzo and decided to move out of Tony's house and into another of Mabel's properties called Los Lobos, which was just about 6 miles up the mountain, not far from the Flying Heart. With him, Lorenzo also brought 2 male Dutch painters. Inevitably, this led to drama between Mabel and the Lawrences, as shortly after the move, Mabel hosted a Christmas party to which the Lawrences declined to attend. The proverbial last straw came when Mabel proposed that the group take a trip to Mexico together, with Lorenzo declining the invitation in a letter that said, quote, "I want to be alone, as much alone as I am while I am here." When writing of these events later, Mabel wrote, quote, "Very well. We would be enemies now."
Oh. You don't really want her,
On your bad side?
Yeah, on your bad side. I mean, she owns half the land in the valley.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Now, what followed was a fairly relentless gossip rampage carried out by both parties. Mabel took to belittling him every chance she had in social engagements, reducing him to what she described as a caricature, and embellished embarrassing stories about him to every person that would listen. Lorenzo did the same in return, telling folks that she tried to make love to him on the roof of her house, and that she had relentlessly tried to get between he and Frieda to make him fall in love with her.
Okay, but when rumors aren't rumors, when they're just true.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, get this. So, exactly what you're thinking. Mabel, is belittling him every chance that she gets, and then in response, he's doing, well, more or less, it seems, telling the exact truth of what happened. Through the grapevine, Mabel heard all of this and claims that upon hearing the gossip, she went into a kind of shock-induced coma and slept for 24 hours straight, all with doctors working around the clock trying to dispense various medicines to her, and Tony hysterically praying on the floor beside her bed.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know that I believe that one.
I don't know. It might have happened.
Now, after Lorenzo's move up to the mountainside with the 2 Danish painters, we do get some insightful perspective as to how D.H. Lawrence was truly feeling about Mabel, Taos, and the people of the Pueblo. Knud Mereld, that's K-N-U-D, it's a Dutch name. I'm 99% sure it's Knud, but I don't think it's Knud. So
no, I know, but I just want to say Knud.
So Knud Mereld, one of the painters that was living with the Lawrences at the time, recalled later a conversation he was having with Lorenzo, in which Lorenzo expressed murderous feelings towards Mabel and racist feelings towards the natives. Knud claims that Lorenzo, speaking about Mabel, said at one point, quote, "I wish you would stop dragging that fat Indian around. Why don't people know their place? I hate having servants around me."
What a jerk.
I know. And that's what I'm saying. It's like, and by the way, this is hearsay. This is years and years later. Knud Mereld claims that this happened. This isn't like in a letter anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be false memories or something. But this, to be honest with you, kind of does sort of seem to fall in line with D.H. Lawrence's off color, let's say.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not a D.H. Lawrence expert, so I could be totally wrong on this stuff, but it just seems like the things that I have read, he did not seem to be any type of a saint by any stretch of the imagination here. Now, we're in January of 1923, and with a little help from Mabel and John Collier, if y'all recall, the Bursum Bill is officially dropped on the Senate floor. Seemingly due to her continued poking of the hornet's nest, the Department of Justice began to take notice of Taos and wanted to see what was causing all this commotion and activism from the tribespeople. Mabel had a friend in Washington who tipped her off as to what the government might do with the knowledge that she and Tony had been having an affair out of wedlock. Further, there was rumor that the government was trying to hatch a legal plan to effectively exile her from New Mexico.
Wait, what?
Yes, seriously. Before anything got up, and basically the reason, by the way, for that was that they there was these laws at the time that were supposedly there to protect the native people's beliefs, religions, and way of life. And the government was trying to form a plan to basically say Mabel is, and I could be a little bit wrong on this, Mabel is more or less corrupting, let's say, one of the high religious figures of the tribe. So with that, let's kick her out of New Mexico because she's causing trouble in that kind of area.
Okay.
Again, I might be just a little off on that. It's a little weird because nothing ever came of it, right? There's nothing actually that was ever
obviously
written.
we're sitting in her house and
Right. But I think that was the general plan of what they were trying to do and how they were trying to kick her out. Now, before anything got out of hand or ruined any reputations, Mabel asked Tony to marry her. And on April 23rd, 1923, Mabel Stern married her fourth and final husband and became Mabel Dodge Luhan.
And she asked him.
Again, old progressive Mabel here, man.
Oh, progressive Mabel.
Always against the norm. Now, happily, despite Mabel's concerns, her mother, Sarah, did not seem to mind much and continued to support her financially. The marriage also quickly made national news with such headlines as, "Why Bohemia's queen married an Indian chief,"
Well, it's pretty sensational.
which was from the Pittsburgh Post. John Evans and his new bride Alice were on their honeymoon in England when they received the news, and John is said to have laid in bed for 2 days from depression.
Oh, gosh.
In a postcard from Lorenzo that a friend of Mabel's received, Lorenzo wrote, quote, "I hear Mabel married Tony. Why?"
I mean, they were kind of having like an affair, and they just make it honest.
When Mabel's second husband, Edwin Dodge, heard the news, he is reported to have said, quote, "Lo, the poor Indian." Once again, Edwin's got some quips, man. He's got some good stuff.
Goodness.
Now, just before this, Lorenzo and Frieda had left Taos with Witter Binner and Spud Johnson for a trip to Mexico, where they stayed for the spring, summer, and fall of 1923, which ultimately helped produce D.H. Lawrence's novel, The Plumed Serpent. For the first half of 1923, Mabel spent time trying to find reliable and discreet treatment for the syphilis she had acquired from Tony, which was a common ailment suffered amongst the tribal nations at the time, as STDs were a relatively new introduction to the Americas.
Ooh, Mabel.
Something to consider, by the way, if anybody doesn't know this, think about the peoples of America before any white people got here. They did not have the immunity that Europeans had. Think about the devastating diseases and viruses that circulated through Europe for thousands of years. All of those people were sitting there developing immunities and antibodies and all this stuff to fight against these. And then all of us came over here to the United States, and all of the people, the native peoples of Americas, had no immunity to any of this stuff. So there were outbreaks of smallpox. There were outbreaks of STDs, which obviously that's not part of immunity and everything like that. But to my knowledge, prior to Europeans coming here, STDs didn't really exist. Or if they did, they were different from the ones in Europe.
Yeah, different. Yeah.
So anyways, Mabel was trying to find some treatment. Again, it's a rough one. What are you gonna do? You know?
Was she getting it for Tony also? The treatment?
I would imagine the tribes people were getting the treatment that they were getting, like that we mentioned earlier,
from the
right?
doctor.
From the doctor.
Yeah.
Whose name?
I
is
guess
escaping me right now.
antibiotics that cured syphilis were around in 1923.
I don't know. No, it was more. That's the thing, is that she was never really able to fight it fully. She always suffered from syphilis her entire life. After she contracted it, she suffered from it, and there was no really good treatment at this point. This is the 20s. You know?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, now it's
There's not
antibiotics.
much.
So
Yeah, there's not much. And I don't even think by this point something like penicillin had even been discovered yet. I could be wrong about that. Medical experts
Where
don't
is
get
our
mad
intern?
at me. I know, we need that intern. Mabel tried to maintain her privacy, but seemingly due to her own inability to keep her mouth shut, word soon got out and gossip began to form. In the summer, she finally relented, writing back to Lorenzo asking for forgiveness and if he might reconsider coming back to Taos. She received his response on October 7th, which was generally friendly. Lorenzo accepted her apology, but never missing a chance to lecture her, said, quote, "You have striven so hard and so long to compel life. Can't you now slowly change and let life slowly drift into you? In seeming contradiction to the alleged racist comments earlier, Lorenzo also said in this letter, quote, "People tell me you are divorcing Tony, and there is another young man, and so on. Probably it's not true. I hope it's not true. I don't think it is. Tony always has my respect and affection."
That's a turn.
Yeah, right? And that's why I wanted to qualify earlier. I don't know that that's true. I don't know that he said that. It wasn't written down anywhere. It's not in a letter. It was something that a friend of his says that he said years after his death. So I wanted to put that out there with a grain of salt, going like, it's entirely possible that he is misremembering. I don't know, because when I hear something like that, this is on paper, him directly saying to Mabel, I respect Tony and I have affection for him.
Or maybe there was some sort of experience in between when he said the thing and went later.
Or he's two-faced.
Or he's two-faced.
I don't know. It's for you as the listener to decide on your own. Now, after expressing some of his opinions on Mabel's involvement with politics and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, he closes by saying, quote, "Even in saying things against you, and I only said with emphasis and in many ways that your will was evil, masquerading as good, and I should still say that of your will, even as an enemy, I never really forsook you."
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of that quite really either. He's basically saying, I still think you're evil, but I never really forsook you. Which, by the way, forsook, I looked up. It's correct.
Okay.
It's not forsaked. It is forsook. He wrote that. This is D.H. Lawrence. I'm not going to question his grammar.
Yeah, touche.
He's a better writer than me. Anyway, around this time, Mabel started to consider bringing out a Russian mystic named George Gurdjieff. George Gurdjieff was a fascinating character from the turn of the 20th century who, prior to becoming something of a cult leader, was a hypnotherapist that specialized in treating addiction.
Oh, very interesting.
By 1912, Gurdjieff started giving lectures on his philosophy, which seemed to be primarily based around self-discovery through very specific aerobic dances.
Okay.
Which seemed to be primarily based around, again, self-discovery, and then began traveling around Europe to attract more followers. In 1922, Gurdjieff established the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man in Avon, France, with a group of his followers, and was calling it a utopia. In the winter of 1924, Mabel was visiting New York to continue her work with psychotherapist Dr. A.A. Brill and saw an advertisement for a speaking engagement being held by one of Gurdjieff's pupils, Jean Toomer. Jean Toomer, by the way, is another one of Mabel's fascinating little interactions. She was very obsessed with this guy for a little bit of time, and I make brief mention of it later, but it's one of the stories that I'm not really going to be going too much into in this podcast. So.
Unfortunate name also.
Jean Toomer?
Toomer?
Oh my God. It's Toomer, so I never even thought of that.
Well, listening, I thought it was the other kind of tumor.
I never even thought about that. That's really funny. She and Tony both attended, and strangely, Gurdjieff's system appealed to Mabel, and she soon began to correspond with him, something we've seen Mabel do many times before. She's a doer. Initially, she wanted Gurdjieff to come out to Taos, and even had the thought that it might just be the perfect spot for a new school of his. These thoughts were soon put to rest, however, when she wrote to D.H. Lawrence asking his opinion on Gurdjieff. Lorenzo's response shocked Mabel, and rightly so, as he expressed his disdain for Gurdjieff and felt he was responsible for the death of his good friend, Catherine Mansfield.
What?
Catherine Mansfield was a massively popular and influential writer from New Zealand who is widely considered to be one of the most influential and important writers of the modernist movement of the time. Lorenzo explained that Catherine Mansfield had been diagnosed with tuberculosis at age 29 and had died under Gurdjieff's care after treating her ailment by having her sleep in a barn loft directly above where the cows lived and slept, as he believed their breath had natural healing abilities.
Okay.
Catherine died under his care, and Lorenzo basically said
Of course she did.
he wouldn't trust him any further than he could throw him.
I'm sorry. I couldn't even let you get through all of that.
Yeah.
Because, okay, I was thinking, well, maybe special dancing could help with your psychotherapy, whatever, because movement, there's a lot of things that scientifically today are like moving your body and dancing and doing something happy could change your... But like, also, you can't just sleep in a haystack of cow breath to cure your tuberculosis. Like, I mean, at least go to like Estes Park, Colorado with the dry
Yes.
air.
Yes.
Like that's
Agreed.
That's what the Stanleys did.
However, it is worth noting that Catherine Mansfield had been seeking a treatment for her tuberculosis for many years, had given up hope in medical science, and was primarily pursuing alternative medicine treatments. And I do think that despite the cow breath treatment being nonsense, Gertzief mostly had a bit of bad luck, and that Catherine's time just happened to be up while undergoing his silly treatment in particular.
Yeah. So it wasn't really him actually killing her. She was on a ticking.
Yes,
the clock
to
was
many
ticking.
other weirdos basically saying,
And
oh, you have
she's
some
like,
pseudoscience.
I'm willing to try this.
And she was. And she had, for several years, been trying a lot of pseudoscience-y methods from these, sort of mystics or people that claim to have healing abilities. None of them worked. And then she ended up at Gertzief's place and ultimately died under his care. I don't condone it, obviously. It's a stupid, your cow's breath isn't going to heal you. But, like, again, I don't...
It was the wrong hayloft at the wrong time.
Right. I just think in this particular instance, I think that D.H. Lawrence's anger is 100% justified.
Yes.
But unfortunately, I think that Gertzief, like, if you look at even just his basic Wikipedia page, it mentions this event, and it's like, well, that kind of sucks, because if you look into it, she had been looking to all these other alternative places.
She was dying.
And the whatever you want to say, the coin fell when...
Did she die in the hayloft?
She died, I want to say that she was, it was actually her going up a set of stairs to the barn loft, and her lung had, I don't know what it would be in a tuberculosis instance, but it was more or less a clot that, I guess, kind of exploded, and she died. Yeah. So again, it was one of those, like, it wasn't that she was, like, sleeping above the cows and she
was
died.
sick
She was
already.
really,
She was
really,
sick
really
if she-
sick. Right.
Okay.
So...
I think
anyways,
a pulmonary embolism maybe is what that is.
I actually think that is exactly what it is. I am not good with medical.
It's only from watching now almost 20 years of Grey's Anatomy.
Oh, gosh. No comment. All I can say is that when I used to live in Cap Hill, and there was this girl in my apartment complex who named her dog Dempsey.
I mean, that's funny. I like it.
And so when I would go to the park, I would just hear, Dempsey, Dempsey, and I wanted to die.
Okay, well, that's annoying, but Dempsey as a name is not necessarily bad.
I'm not saying his last name is bad, but to call your dog Dempsey constantly, I don't know. And
I named my dog Zucchini, so...
You didn't. The adoption place did, right?
No, I named her Zucchini. Her name was Francie.
I thought it was Zucchini.
No, it was Francie. The reason she's named Zucchini is because that was what I meant to buy at the farmer's market that day.
And you got a dog instead?
Yeah, I went to go buy zucchini to make zucchini chips because I was trying to eat healthy, as I always am trying to eat healthy. And then instead of getting zucchini from the $10 fill a bag guy, I got a dog instead. And her name was Francie. And I was like, well, that's silly. And then I kind of wanted to name her Fancy after that Reba McEntire song, Here's Your One Chance, Fancy, Don't Let Me Down.
Oh my gosh.
But then zucchini seemed right. And this dog is totally a weirdo, so Zucchini turned out to be the perfect name for her.
Zucchini's sweet. I like her.
She's a wonderful dog, and again, I think Dempsey's not so bad. I mean, it's better than naming your child Dempsey.
I agree with that.
Which is definitely not...
Gosh, we're going to get a letter from somebody with a kid named Dempsey, and it's not going to be good.
I mean, I don't know. Now I'm just picturing Patrick Dempsey, and I'm not sad. I mean, come on.
Nor am I, honestly.
McDreamy. Okay.
I can admit that Patrick Dempsey's a handsome man.
He is a handsome man.
He is, good looking. Nevertheless, Mabel trusted Lorenzo's opinion, and nothing ever came from her interaction with George Gertzief.
Okay, I'm a little bit sad right now about George Gertzief, though. I kind of wanted him to be here and do some ribbon dancing.
There was a point later on when she started to engage with Jean Toomer, because Jean was obviously this kind of disciple, more or less, of Gertzief. And there was like a talk of that happening, but nothing ever happened. So
Oh, well. Gertzief.
it was now the spring of 1924, and Mabel was vacationing in California with Tony and the Colliers when she received word that D.H. Lawrence was officially on his way back to Taos. So Mabel cut her vacation plans short and headed back to New Mexico. Along with them, the Lawrences had brought along the Honorable Dorothy Brett. And I'm just going to have so much fun talking about Dorothy Brett because she might be my favorite character in the entire freaking series we've been through so far.
Interesting.
Dorothy, and for both good and bad reasons. She's hilarious and crazy, and I love her. Dorothy Brett, or Brett as most friends called her, was a London-born painter whose father was an influential politician who served in the court of Queen Victoria. And Brett spent parts of her sheltered childhood at the Windsor Castle, attending dance lessons with Princess Beatrice as the Queen looked on.
Oh, very fancy.
Her grandfather had been the Master of the Rolls, and upon his retirement was given the title of Viscount Esher, which is what gave him and his descendants the honorable title. Kind of like how... What's that?
What's a Escher?
I don't know. You'll have to look into British...
Is it like an etcher?
I thought
If
it was...
he was something about the scrolls?
I'm not gonna front, okay? I thought it was Viscount Escher because it's spelt Viscount.
Oh, okay.
And when I told Kat, she looks at me like I'm insane. And she goes, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, it's like Dorothy Brett's like grandfather was made. I think it was Viscount Escher." And she goes, "I've heard Viscount. Do you mean Viscount?" And I was like, maybe.
Okay, so for the folks at home that feel like, well, I wouldn't have known that either, Kat has a little bit of more knowledge of things because of her heritage.
Her parents are Welsh, so she generally is better with things of the British nature.
She's our resident Brit.
Brit-in-chief?
Chief, knowledge Brit. I don't know. The Britannica.
Yes, but
she's our Britannica.
Either way, I apologize if it's actually Viscount Esser. Whatever, I don't know. I think it's Viscount
Google it
Escher.
later.
But anyways, that is what
He
gave her.
He was a very important dude.
Well, yeah, he was the Master of the Rolls, and so the Queen basically gave him that title of Viscount Escher. And it's very similar to how, like in the UK, a lord, for example,
or a duke, or something like that.
They are made that way because they inherit a piece of land, right? It's not because they're knighted. It's just because you are now the inheritor of this whatever manor. So now you're Lord something something something. It's of the same
title.
line.
Okay.
It's a title, and now you're honorable, even though Dorothy Brett is not a... I don't want to say she's not an honorable person, but she's very funny, let's just say. She's a very funny person. Eventually, Brett wound up at the Slade School of Art, where she met Lady Ottiline Morell, the source of inspiration for D.H. Lawrence's novel, Women in Love, who then introduced her to an artist circle that included Bertrand Russell, George Bernard Shaw, Virginia Woolf, Aldous Huxley, and, of course, D.H. Lawrence. Dorothy Brett was immediately taken by Lorenzo, and she would spend the rest of his life by his side. Mabel describes meeting Brett for the first time, saying, quote, "Her long, thin shanks ended in large feet that turned out abruptly, like the kind that children draw. She was an amusing and attractive, grotesque, curious, arrogant, and English."
I'm just picturing someone with extremely big, wide-set feet, like a first-position ballerina.
Look up a picture of Dorothy Brett. I personally think she's kind of cute. She's kind of cute. She's like a little...
Well, no, she did say she said something positive in there along with grotesque.
And a lot of times I do think in this old-fashioned kind of writing, the term grotesque, and we've used this before when she was writing about Carl van Vechten spending a lot of time in Harlem, she said he loved the grotesque. Mm-hmm. I'm starting to think that it was much more... it was probably used to... Yeah, it was probably used to describe something as... Yes, I would almost definitely say it was unusual rather than gross, like we would think of it right now. Mm-hmm. So I would imagine that when she was saying that, she was like, oh, she was an attractive grotesque. She's probably like, she was attractive in a weird way.
Yeah, she was not a traditional beauty.
Yeah, so I'm thinking that was probably how the language was at the time, and I think it's just evolved to be something else. Brett would eventually become a permanent fixture in Mabel's life, with the two becoming close friends later. But while D.H. Lawrence was still in the picture, the two women would remain relative enemies. One of Brett's most defining characteristics was a large brass ear trumpet that she affectionately called Toby, which was used not only to aid in some of her hearing loss that she had in her left ear, but also as a tool for eavesdropping on conversations, as well as a source of genuine comic relief. We'll see. It is awesome. And by the way, for anybody that Googles a picture of Dorothy Brett, almost every single picture is of her holding up this gigantic ear trumpet. And if you don't know what an ear trumpet is,
I do, and I am so
explain
excited.
it. Please explain
it's
it.
just like it's kind of like a funnel almost, like to put in your ear, right? So that you can hear and it magnifies the sound. But I feel like if I ever lose my hearing or have not a major loss in hearing, maybe I ought to get an ear trumpet so that I can just have that instead.
Yeah. And it literally, she called it Toby. So she'd be like, oh, where's Toby? And it was so like, it was a character.
I feel like there's something with like Alice in Wonderland, or like when you were talking about her, I was like picturing her like a Looney Tunes cartoon, like listening through the wall and like kind of like a ballerina in a tutu with her feet out and just like leaning over. I don't know. I just got this ridiculous image of her in my head.
That is kind of her spirit.
Okay.
I
Maybe
can't explain
she's
it.
like in my brain right now because I'm here and she's like, oh, you like this? Let me just like push into your brain.
She's a hoot. That's all I can say. And also a very brilliant painter. So if you ever look up paintings by Dorothy Brett, she painted a lot of Native American imagery and stuff like that. Very beautiful stuff. Now, things seemed to get right back onto track when the Lawrences arrived back in town. That is, with the exception of Brett being added to the group. Mabel found, even more so than before with the ever-present Frieda, that Brett, too, was hell-bent on preventing Lorenzo and Mabel from ever having a private moment together. Mabel's attempts at playing a submissive housewife were also amplified during this time, and in a very telling story of Mabel's mental state when Lorenzo was around, she found her horse riding skills to diminish, describing it as feeling less confident and more docile. I know.
And she wanted to give him her weird sexual power, but the reality was he had the power.
He really did. And we've spent how many hours talking about Mabel? Have you ever seen her react like this to literally anyone?
No, not like this. The only thing I can think of that's similar is when her husband and they were in Florence and he was like, I'm going back to the United States and you better come along. And she kind of was like, okay.
Yeah. And then maybe with her ignoring Bindo a little bit. But
yeah. But like, this is interesting.
Like this.
But I was thinking about this while you were talking earlier. I was like, okay, why is she like so up in arms about D.H. Lawrence? And it's like, because he was an actual famous author.
And pretty inarguably a genius.
Yeah. And so she actually had someone in her orbit that was truly famous, not just wealthy or a socialite or something, but like world known. And so she was like, this guy really could put me on the map. Okay. So now she's got Brett, and then that she was in with the other people you mentioned, Huxley and like other ones. So like she's networking.
Oh yeah. But Lawrence was the one that she just, he
was a trophy.
And it was even beyond that. It was just, it speaks to, like we were saying earlier, his weird magnetism. He just seemed to have this ability to really put a spell on people. And Mabel was a full force victim to the point where she's changing the way that she's dressing. Mm-hmm. She's changing the way that she's engaging with him. She's not able to ride a horse as well as she was able to.
When in reality,
she was a teen.
The irony of this is she's that kind of person for others.
Hilarious.
Like he's like her Achilles heel when she's like other people's Achilles heel.
Oh, that's a great little parallel. I honestly didn't even think about that. That is a really, really
And that
good
probably
insight.
was what really got under her skin too. She's like, I'm supposed to be the one that is in control.
Yeah. Now, Mabel's decreased riding skills in Lorenzo's presence were also made even worse when she would see the helpless Brett over on the side who had never learned to ride, and as a result, Lorenzo spent more time trying to engage with her and offering riding advice.
Jealousy.
In another example of the determined rivalry between the two women, the time came one day for Mabel to get her hair cut. In the past, when Lorenzo's beard started to get out of control, Mabel would be occasionally permitted to trim it down for him, something she loved to do. So naturally, with her hair getting a bit lengthy, Mabel tried to drop the hint that it might be nice to not go all the way to Santa Fe for a trim. He almost definitely was picking up on the hints that Mabel was given, but wouldn't take the bait. Eagerly, Dorothy Brett declared that she would be more than happy to cut Mabel's hair. In fact, she already knew how to cut a bob-style haircut as Catherine Mansfield, before her passing, had the same style of haircut, and Brett would often play hairstylist for her. Not being keen on the idea, but also not wanting to be, any kind of a spoiler of moods or upset anyone, Mabel reluctantly agreed. She sat down in a chair, and Brett soon began to snip away at Mabel's hair with Lorenzo looking on and giving pointers. Snip, snip here, snip, snip there, just a little bit of length off the sides here, and snip, oops! Blood began to gush down the side of Mabel's face as she cried out in pain. Brett had snipped off part of Mabel's ear.
Oh my gosh. I'm wearing headphones, folks, and it's like I just want to like push on my ears.
Yeah.
And like I can't. And ow.
Yes. Ouchie, 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 ouch.
Do you put it on a bag with ice? The rest of that ear? Like I know there's nothing you can do at this point.
I think it was like a little corner of her ear, basically.
Okay, but still.
Well, I know. She was in such shock after the initial cut that she simply stared at Brett in disbelief and said, "Why, you cut my ear off."
I mean, that's what I would think.
Right. Mabel was aware that Brett hated her, but she was in utter disbelief that someone could go so far as to snip part of her ear off.
I mean, I think it was probably an accident.
Was this an accident? We don't know.
I mean, I don't think people are that maniacal. And then they become friends later, right?
After, sorry, spoiler alerts, D.H. Lawrence dies before
you
his
mentioned
time,
that already.
so to speak. But after his death, Brett lives in Taos for the rest of her life, and she and Mabel became good
it was
friends.
probably an accident.
I hope
Besides,
so.
I mean, the scissors 100 years ago, literally, this was 1924?
Yes.
Okay, so almost exactly 100 years ago. I think they just weren't that great.
That is entirely
we
possible.
We can blame the scissors.
That's true. Very possible. To give a good example of how Brett used her beloved ear trumpet Toby as a tool for comedy, one day, as Mabel was headed out for a walk, she saw Brett puttering around her garden not far away. The exchange went something like this. Mabel, seeing Brett, shouts, "Isn't it a wonderful day?" Brett looked puzzled as she held her ear trumpet up to the side of her face and shouted back to Mabel, "Hay? Is Jose cutting hay?" Mabel shouted back even louder, "No! I said, isn't it a wonderful day?" Brett finally cut the act and acknowledged the statement, but retorted with, "What of it? What about the day?" Mabel spat back, "Oh, shut up," and stormed off.
I'm so sorry. This is making me think of a joke.
Uh-oh.
I heard it relatively recently. Just a joke about hearing loss. Okay. So there's a husband, and he goes to his annual checkup. And he says to the doctor, "Hey, doc, I think my wife might be losing her hearing." You know, he's getting up there in age, and the couple is. And the doctor says, "Oh, really?" He's like, "Yeah, but, I don't really want to get her upset about it, but I kind of want to see, can you think of a way I could, test her hearing?" And so the doctor says, "Oh, yes. Okay, well, when you get home, ask her what's for dinner, but do it from across the room. And then if she doesn't respond, move closer, and then eventually you'll see." So he gets home and he opens the door, and he's, across the kitchen, kind of far away. And he says, "Hey, honey, what's for dinner?" And she's standing at the sink, and she's, washing some dishes, and she doesn't say anything. And so he steps a little bit closer. "Hey, honey, what's for dinner?" No response. So he steps a little bit closer. "Hey, honey, what's for dinner?" Still nothing. So he gets right next to her, and he's like, "Honey, what's for dinner?" And she says, "For the fourth time, it's lasagna."
What?
He can't hear.
Oh. I'm dumb. That's funny.
It's a pretty good joke.
That's a good joke. That's a good joke. I don't know, I was waiting for her to just be like, we're not eating anything. It's like, she heard him every time, but just decided to not respond.
No, she did respond.
Exactly.
He couldn't hear.
Yes. He just,
I
back
thought
was
that was
turned.
funny. Anyway,
No, that is
I
funny.
mean, maybe he needs an ear trumpet, the man in the
Maybe.
joke.
Now, one last story about Mabel and Brett, because it's just too good not to share. These women were seriously competing for the affections of D.H. Lawrence. In one story, during their time together, Mabel was hanging out at the Lawrences' house and complimented Lorenzo on a small painting he had done, so he gave it to her as a gift. Dorothy Brett, undoubtedly having overheard this interaction with the aid of her trusty friend, Toby, stole the painting from Mabel's house the next day.
A heist.
A heist. When Mabel discovered that her painting was missing, she headed straight for Brett's house, burst through the door, and began turning over furniture, tossing things around, determined to find her painting. When she at last found the painting and held it up triumphantly, Brett ran over, grabbed the painting from her hands, and booked it out the door. A chase was afoot. The skinny Dorothy Brett made for a quick lead, but if you've ever played Mario Kart, you know the small carts have good acceleration, but the big carts have better top speed. Before long, Mabel closed the gap and got her painting back. Though I cannot find a source to confirm this, I really hope Mabel tackled her to the ground. Remember, this was 1924. To paint the scene that just unfolded, you have a now 45-year-old Mabel chasing a 41-year-old Dorothy Brett down a dusty dirt road to take back a painting that was stolen from her, made by a 38-year-old D.H. Lawrence. You can't make this stuff up. Hilariously, Mabel's hatred of Brett seemed to help snap her out of her submissive hypnosis in regards to Lorenzo. Such was the loathing for Brett that Mabel and Frieda began to grow closer as friends, if not only to get together and complain about the annoying, not honorable Dorothy Brett. Mabel could just not understand how Lorenzo was perfectly happy to have Brett sit in his studio for hours on end, staring at him work, and much to his delight, but if she were to do the same, Lorenzo would promptly ask her to leave. Why was Brett so great, but not Mabel? One day, she asked him directly. In classic fashion, Lorenzo was blunt as ever and said that Brett just had a way about her that really seemed to inspire things in him. Obviously, this enraged Mabel. This was exactly what she fancied herself to be. When she initially asked this to Lorenzo, the two were out riding horses, and her rage quickly turned back to love as Lorenzo kicked back his heels on his horse to gain speed, and when he passed Mabel, his leg brushed up against her thigh, which she took as a sign of his affection, noting later that he would never have done such a thing with Brett.
Okay.
I know, that, again, it's another Mabelism where I'm just like, all right, if you say so. After some time, it seemed that once again, Lorenzo began to feel restless, with his mind often going back to his long-thought dream of starting his own utopia. So, the Lawrences proposed to Mabel that they move onto John Evans's ranch, which Lorenzo later renamed Lobo. For one reason or another, Mabel doubled down. How about, instead of just staying there, she just give the ranch to them? After she bought it back from John Evans, of course. Lorenzo refused, but Frieda had better sense and gladly accepted the offer, and as payment for the land and house, Frieda gave Mabel the original manuscript of Lorenzo's novel, The Plumed Serpent, sure to be a literary diamond. Surprisingly, this gesture from Frieda actually seemed to upset Mabel, and she eventually gave the manuscript to her psychotherapist, Dr. Brill, as payment for treating one of her friends. And by the way, that I've tried to do more digging and find more information about this. I don't know what ended up happening with the original manuscript of The Plumed Serpent, because very little is mentioned in Mabel's writings about it. I found it in other readings that of people that did other research, but even in those writings, it's sort of like, oh yeah, it went to Dr. Brill, and that's it. I don't know what happened to it
Maybe Dr.
after
Brill's
that.
family still has it.
It's entirely possible, but
It's not notable because it hasn't ended up at Sotheby's or whatever.
Or I mean, like a lot of Mabel's writings, they're at like universities. They're at Yale University, and a lot of other people's are as well. They have these really lovely collections of old writings. But in this case, if anybody knows what happened to the original manuscript of the Plumed Serpent, I'd be very curious to know. So shoot us an email. In regards to Mabel giving a sizable piece of land to the Lawrences, Tony was not happy. Not only had he taken to using the land to graze his horses, he explained that many of his tribespeople like to hunt there. So an agreement was made between the Lawrences and Tony, and he could still keep visiting rights to the land. Before long, Lorenzo, Frieda, and Brett were all living on the Lobo Ranch, with Lorenzo busying himself around the whole land, the whole property, doing carpentry, cooking, and any other number of chores, which seemed to strangely really suit him. He was like really in his element when he was just like doing basic housework. I don't know. In the fall of 1924, Mabel left New Mexico again, headed for New York and her continued work with Dr. Brill. Brill, as he had done many times before, encouraged her to do her own work rather than try to focus on work of others, as she had made her life's mission. So, during the winter of 1924, Mabel decided to camp out back at Finney Farms and officially start to write her life's story.
Nice.
Much of her story had already been written in various pieces here and there. This was something that she had done all of her life, obviously, but this time it was official. She soon returned to Taos and found that, a bit to her surprise, Lorenzo was quite enthusiastic, encouraging even at the prospect of Mabel writing her memoirs. Now that the Lawrences were living on Lobo Ranch, there was some initial headbutting that occurred between Tony and Lorenzo. See, Tony wanted to hunt for porcupines as they destroyed the pine trees, but Lorenzo said he liked the porcupines. Mabel was between a rock and a hard place. She understood Lorenzo's perspective. It was his land, and he didn't ask Tony to protect his trees from porcupines. But she could see Tony's perspective. He had always hunted and spent time there, much more time than Lorenzo, and had always done so. The entire situation came to a head the next morning. Mabel was staying at a cottage just up the hill from the Lawrences' house, so she wrote a note requesting that Lorenzo come speak with her, and had her friend Clarence, who was there too, deliver it for her. Clarence returned a short while later with a note from Lorenzo saying that if she wanted to speak with him, she could come down the hill.
What?
Mabel stormed over to the Lawrences' house intending to give him a piece of her mind. But when she walked through the door, all she could manage to get out was, "How can you treat me like that?" and burst into tears.
Oh, Mabel.
You know. Lorenzo, blunt as ever, simply looked at her and said, quote, "Well, I couldn't stand a certain way you walk as you went by my window this morning."
What? Golly.
I told you. I don't particularly care for D.H. Lawrence the more that
I'm not sad that he's going to have an untimely death.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, I guess that was harsh. But
Just a little bit.
I don't know. He's just like kind of a jerk. Like,
He is kind of a jerk.
if you don't
I
have
think.
something nice to say, don't say nothing.
He is
anything
that
at
way a
all.
lot, yes. And that's one of the reasons I don't really like him. Now, Mabel cried some more, but eventually the two made up and she and Tony returned to Taos. This really did seem, however, to be the first turning point of Mabel's obsession with D.H. Lawrence. I should also say that, for anyone interested, I have given a fairly general overview of the interactions between Mabel and Lorenzo, and much of what I have read included Lorenzo's seemingly massive misogynistic views. I'm shying away from going into detail on them as I haven't researched D.H. Lawrence thoroughly enough, and I don't want to say things that might not be totally true. However, according to Mabel, throughout her interactions with him, he would often reference things like, quote, "natural order of women being submissive to men."
Well, he did like him in an apron.
Yeah, which accounts for a lot of her behavior during this time, right? She was like, okay, if that's how you want me to be, then I will kind of submit to you. But as I mentioned earlier, though I am no expert, from what I understand, it is entirely possible that D.H. Lawrence was indeed a closeted gay man. And at this time period, being raised in the very English environment that he was, there was undoubtedly some emotional and psychological baggage that he was carrying, which was contrasted by societal norms that he was living in. I don't want to play, too much of an armchair psychologist here, so I can only imagine what must have been going on in D.H. Lawrence's brain to make him believe some of the things that he believed. But anyway, that's for another day. Later that summer, an event would unfold that would ultimately mark the last time that Mabel and Lorenzo saw one another ever again. In the summer of 1925, Mabel had some friends out in Taos visiting from New York, so she decided to have a small dinner party and invited the Lawrences to come along with a few other friends that were, local to the town, including people like Spud Johnson and the young man simply known as Clarence, who had been her messenger during that porcupine incident, right? For a while, Mabel had been noticing that Clarence and Lorenzo had been spending quite a bit of time together, describing their relationship as, quote, intimate. After dinner, Lorenzo and Clarence said they were going to step out to the porch to talk. After what seemed like a few hours had passed, and with Lorenzo and Clarence being well out of view of anyone at the party, Frieda finally decided enough was enough and announced she was going to go break them up. According to Mabel, when the three returned, she was able to pull Clarence away for long enough to squeeze some gossip out of him.
Ooh.
What was he and Lorenzo talking about for so long? It took some convincing, but Clarence finally relented. He admitted to Mabel that he and Lorenzo had been making secret plans to run away together in the night and never return to Taos.
What?
Yeah. Which, again, I don't play too much of an armchair psychologist here or whatever, but if you can imagine being that type of person in this time period, like a gay person who can't be themselves,
Right.
you know what I mean?
No.
It's a...
But he's also...
My heart goes out to him, I guess.
Lorenzo is also married.
He is. I mean, I don't want to say that Frieda was a beard. I don't think that that's really true, because I really do think they loved each other a lot, I'm not even going to go into it even anymore, because I don't know enough about it to speak to it confidently. So
But they were going to possibly run off.
They were. That this is true, according to Mabel, that he and Clarence were planning to run off together into the desert and never return to Taos. Naturally, Mabel told Frieda immediately. But we don't know what Frieda did with that information. A few weeks later, Mabel was throwing a similar dinner party, and as the night progressed, with a little help from some bootleg liquor, dancing inevitably ensued, and after a while, Lorenzo noticed that Clarence had been dancing with Frieda for just a bit too long. Mabel had been bothering Lorenzo to dance all night and somehow finally relented, much to Mabel's delight. It soon became apparent to Mabel, however, that she had little to do with the dance at hand, as every chance Lorenzo got, he'd use her as his own personal billy club, purposefully leading Mabel to step on toes or straight up bashing Mabel's hips into the side of Clarence or Frieda.
Poor Mabel.
I know. To add to the scene, Dorothy Brett danced circles around both couples, no human partner, just her good old brass ear trumpet Toby, stepping on Mabel's toes whenever she could. When the music finally stopped, Clarence and Frieda disappeared together. Clarence and Frieda, again, disappeared together out into the night. Mabel couldn't believe what she was seeing and tried to get Lorenzo as fired up as she possibly could. Lorenzo just laughed and said somewhat sarcastically, youth and middle age.
Oh, interesting.
Tony soon insisted that they go to bed, and though he was able to fall asleep quickly, Mabel lay awake in the hammock of her upper porch until she heard the approaching voices of Clarence and Frieda. The voices continued to speak, but Mabel couldn't hear, and, probably thinking she was a pro and remembering her sneak-out-of-bed days with Maurice and Tony, crept out of bed, down the stairs, out the door, through the hall, and halfway across the yard before the bellow of a clearly furious Tony pierced through the cool desert night. "Come back here!" screamed Tony. She only paused for a moment before pressing on.
I mean, I'm thinking what she needed there is an ear trumpet. Then she could have stayed safely in her hammock.
She could have. Mabel was determined to find out what had happened. She soon discovered that Frieda had gone to bed, but Clarence was still up, so she went to his bedroom and pressed him for information. Clarence said that he and Frieda talked about many things, but in particular, Frieda said that Lawrence was out to destroy Mabel, and that Frieda was actually afraid of him.
Huh.
Kind of crazy.
Plot thickens.
Not much else could be discussed, however, as they soon heard the sound of a nearby car engine cough to life and then set out into the desert night. Tony had left.
Tony, he's
know.
mad.
The next morning, Mabel awoke to the sound of shouting and discovered that Lorenzo was arguing with Clarence.
A lover's spat.
Yes, the specifics of the argument can only be speculated, but it ended with Clarence shouting at Lorenzo, "You devil, I know you now!" To which Lorenzo shouted back, "And I know you now, to my chagrin!"
Oh, no.
Tony, who had apparently come back in the morning, drove the Lawrences back to Lobo Ranch and upon returning said to Mabel, quote, "I think we've done enough for those Lawrences. I'm going to send for my mare. Better my nephew use her." There may have been one other small public gathering where Mabel and Lorenzo saw one another, but that was it. The Lawrences soon left for Mexico before ultimately going to France, where D.H. Lawrence died of tuberculosis less than 5 years later, on March 2nd, 1930, at the age of just 44.
Ugh, he died the same thing as his friend.
As his friend, except, I guess, thankfully a little bit, not above a cow
Not
barn.
above in a hot old hay yeah, I don't even know.
After the Lawrences left, things went on as usual for Mabel for a while. For a time, she developed a small obsession with poet Jean Toomer, who we've mentioned a few times before, a follower of George Kurtzeff. She continued to travel, continued to work in psychotherapy, continued to write page after page of her memoirs, and continued to invite various artists to Taos for inspiration. Too many to list, honestly. In 1929, Mabel was at a dance in Santa Fe where she ran into painter Georgia O'Keeffe, who had just arrived in New Mexico. Mabel insisted she come to Taos and without asking permission, sent for George's trunk to be taken to her house and told her so after the fact.
What?
Yeah, just
Mabel.
basically like, "Hey, you're coming, by the way. Your trunk's already on the way to Taos."
Okay. And George is like, who is this woman?
So, well, I'm about to say, Mabel had met Georgia years prior in New York through photographer Alfred Stieglitz. I'm not sure if you remember him. We mentioned him in episode 2 of our series. He founded the legendary photography and art studio known as Gallery 291, named after his apartment number. He was actually married to Georgia O'Keeffe. A little bit of a scandalous story there. I'm not going to go into it in this episode. Maybe we'll get into that another day or whatever. But Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz, despite, I want to say, like a 25 or 30-year gap in their ages, they eventually fell in love and got married. Mabel didn't much care for O'Keeffe's early work, saying that she was too obsessed with genitalia. If you know Georgia O'Keeffe's
that's
work, that's
kind of her gig.
That's her gag. I want to say gag. It's not that.
It's her deal.
But once she began to paint in Taos, Mabel described a change, saying, quote, "Things appeared to her visually enhanced. People were revealed more fully to her and seemed brought further into being than those she had known. When Georgia came to the high table land of Taos, it made her heart beat high. She was exultant and enchanted." Mabel hosted O'Keeffe in one of her homes, gave her an art studio to work out of, and in this time period, it would ultimately come to mark a turning point in Georgia O'Keeffe's career, where she would develop the style of painting we know her for today. It all kind of started here in Taos.
Nice.
Pretty cool. Also around this time, a 27-year-old photographer named Ansel Adams, who is now widely considered the greatest photographer of all time, came to stay with Mabel as he planned to photograph the American Southwest for the Sierra Club. Pretty cool.
Okay.
While in Taos, Ansel met photographer Paul Strand, who completely changed the way that Ansel Adams viewed photography as an art form. Just a few years later, Ansel, along with the photographer Willard Van Dyke, established the legendary society of photographers known as Group F64. Which, if anybody's not familiar with photography, F marks what's called the f-stop. It's basically the aperture or the pinhole size of exposure. And F64 is generally only available on what are called field cameras. They're these huge cameras that will expose directly onto like 8x11 prints. And that's what Ansel and all his group of dudes did, was on these amazing, beautiful cameras. And if you ever see Ansel Adams' work, it is so crystal clear. It is so sharp. And it is specifically because he was shooting on these things called field cameras and at this f-stop called F64. So just
nice.
Cool little aside. There was a point in 1931 that Mabel took a vacation to Mexico with her son, John Evans, who was having some marital problems with his wife, Alice. Mabel never really liked Alice a whole lot, at least not for her son, so while on vacation, Mabel arranged for author Claire Spencer to accompany them. One thing led to another, and not long after they arrived back in Taos, John Evans was asking for a divorce from Alice.
No.
By 1933, the couple had officially divorced, and John Evans married Claire Spencer.
Man.
I know.
Mabel's just passing that along to her kid.
You know?
And also, oh yeah, John Evans.
I think I said in episode
and
1.
John was there.
Yeah, it's like that's basically how he was always sort of in her life, was like, I'm doing all this stuff. Oh, and then John came around and that was kind of it, you know?
Poor John.
Once Mabel had heard about D.H. Lawrence's death, she decided that there might be a market for folks wanting to get a more intimate view into his life, so she decided to write a book about their time together. Unfortunately, she was not the only woman over the years to fall under the spell of D.H. Lawrence, and several others across the globe had planned to write books about their time with him as well. But thanks to her already expansive and constant journaling, Mabel was able to write and have a book published within just 2 years after his death. In 1932, at the age of 53, Mabel finally made her true literary debut with her first published novel, Lorenzo and Taos.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's never too late, folks.
Never too late, guys. Reviews were mostly positive, with the New York Times saying, quote, Mabel Luhan tells the story with an intense, pained honesty that gives the reader a shocked sense that he has intruded on privacies never meant for print. But Lawrence himself believed in honesty rather than privacy. It is always a moving book, at times a revolting book, at other times almost a very great book.
Almost a very great book.
Which, apart from the sentiment of saying almost a very great book, I almost feel like that last sentiment is a pretty good kind of sentence about Mabel's whole life. It is always moving, at times revolting, and almost very great.
Yeah, that's actually
that's fairly accurate about her as a person, I think, you know? Anyhow, the New York Evening Post didn't like Mabel's blunt take on an iconic literary master, saying, quote, the picture of Lawrence as a sadistic, violent, arrogant, hypersensitive man must be considerably repulsive. Since Mrs. Luhan has no literary record of importance to justify her part in the drama, many readers will regard her quite unfavorably.
Well,
I think people could say the same of us. Right?
touche.
I actually think, I literally just wrote this in it. Actually, it's a little bit different. I actually think this same exact critique could be applied to our listeners that are learning about Mabel through this series, right? Is that exact sentiment of like, she has no record of importance, so like all of this drama that unfolded, like you might look at her unfavorably. Anyway, regardless of critical opinion on her book, she was being talked about on a national, even global level at this point.
All press is good press.
All press is good press. And once more, many people were understandably impressed with her work. Even more so than the various news columns or magazines that she had written articles for, she was now being seen as an actual respected writer. Not just sort of like a, paid for hire hired gun to sling out a little column every once in a while, In 1933, she published her first memoir titled Background, covering the year of her birth in 1879 rather, to the age of 18 in 1897. This would become part 1 of 4 of her full autobiography known as Intimate Memories. This second publication didn't attract quite as much buzz as Lorenzo and Taos, but still did quite well and was received pretty well by not only critics, but by people that were just hungry for a good read. And her publishers were happy. That summer, Mabel's mother, Sarah Ganson, had passed away.
Oh, I was wondering. She'd been around for a long time.
She made it quite a long time. So Mabel now found herself in huge debt.
Uh-oh.
Good old debt. Gone were the days of living in luxury, and the humble life of Mabel Dodge Luhan now began.
Okay.
Now, despite being dead and buried, D.H. Lawrence would still have one bit of drama to give to Mabel.
Okay.
In 1935, Frieda Lawrence, who had moved back to Taos after Lorenzo's death with her lover, Angelino Rivalli, finally arranged to have Lorenzo's body exhumed from where it was buried in France to be taken back to New Mexico, where Frieda planned initially to build a kind of mausoleum for him. In order to bring the body back safely to Taos, Frieda sent Angelino to accomplish the errand. What followed could undoubtedly become a 1980s comedy film called The Adventures of Angelino Rivalli and the Remains of D.H. Lawrence. After having the body exhumed, Angelino discovered that the legality behind shipping a body internationally from France to America was quite a feat, and costly too. So, he learned, however, that the ashes of a human were much easier to transport internationally.
I was thinking that.
He had Lawrence's body cremated.
Uh-oh.
Upon arriving back in America via a port in New York, he almost forgot the ashes at customs.
Oh my gosh.
And then did indeed forget them at a train station in Lammy, New Mexico.
How do you forget your one charge, man?
After being picked up in a car by Frieda Lawrence.
Oh no. And she's like, hey, where's the husband I sent you to get?
Halfway back to Taos, the two realized they'd forgotten his remains. So they doubled back, and they were thankfully there and recovered them.
Okay, this is like Get Him to the Greek.
Yes. Or like Weekend at Bernie's, but with ashes. During this whole time, Mabel was hatching a plot to take back Lorenzo's ashes. See, Frieda had built a small chapel way out in the desert and had planned to inter the remains at sunset while Native American drummers chanted and banged their drums in rhythm. However, Mabel says that Lorenzo would never have wanted this, and that he had specifically asked for his ashes to be scattered in order to be returned to the earth. So Mabel started to tell all the local tribes people that the ashes were cursed.
Oh my gosh.
And was even hatching a plan to steal the ashes away.
Okay, but also, would he even want the native people around at all? He was like racist against them.
I know. I also am very confused by Frieda thinking this is what he would have wanted in any way, shape, or form. Because ultimately, all said and done, D.H. Lawrence was in New Mexico for like 2 years.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe she just wanted them near him or near her.
It's possible, but even though she lived in Taos for the remainder of her life as well, I don't know if I mentioned that, Frieda Lawrence did too. The chapel where D.H. Lawrence is to this day, where his remains are to this day, are honestly, I don't even know. They're way out of town, way out of town. Like, and they're really remote too. Like the spot is not like, you can't just like drive to it, to my understanding. Like it's very, very, very private. So yeah. Anyway.
Okay. Well.
When she caught wind of this, Frieda had the ashes mixed into a brick of cement so that there was nothing else to do but leave it in the chapel.
That
crazy, right? D.H. Lawrence is in a brick, right? Years and years later, after the deaths of both Mabel and Frieda, years even after the publishing of the two main biographies that I read on Mabel, in the 1980s, Angelino Rivalli, close to the end of his life, told a close friend that there was one final twist to the tale of D.H. Lawrence's remains.
And what was it?
Supposedly, Angelino said that even after getting the body cremated, he tried to bring the ashes on the ship, but discovered there was also a tax on that. Not wanting to pay, Angelino dumped his ashes into the Mediterranean Sea and replaced them with dirt and dust.
No
It is
way.
entirely possible that the quote-unquote brick of Lorenzo's remains that sits in the tiny chapel in New Mexico to this day is nothing more than a brick.
Oh my gosh.
Seriously.
Okay. That's amazing.
It's insane, right?
That's amazing.
That's why I said this could be a 1980s comedy film. And this is the movie has you think ended, and then it fades back up from black, and it's like 30 years later.
Yes.
And it's him like drinking a scotch by the fireplace going, you know, I need to tell you something. He's Italian.
Uh-huh.
I need to tell you something. His remains Lorenzo, they are not his remains. More or less.
A twist.
How crazy is that?
I love it.
Super fun.
I mean, not for D.H. Lawrence, but like it's an interesting story.
But also depending on
He
whose story
probably
you
would have
believe.
rather be in the Mediterranean.
That's exactly what I was going to say. If Mabel was... Some people don't believe that Mabel's story is true, obviously. That some people say that she made it up to just try to get his ashes back. But a lot of other folks say that, no, like, from what they know about D.H. Lawrence, that is more what he would have wanted, is to have ashes scattered somewhere. And even Angelino says he believed that's what Lawrence would have wanted more. So... In a weird way, it's sort of like everybody got what they wanted. Frieda got what she wanted, and then kind of D.H. Lawrence got what he wanted, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Very interesting, though.
Very, very interesting. In 1935 and then 1936, now at the age of 57, Mabel released her second, third, and fourth memoirs. First with European Experiences, accounting for her life from 1898 to 1912, taking Mabel from age 18 to 33. And then with Winter in Taos, which described her first winter. Much of what we talked about in the third episode of this series was from Winter in Taos. Her third memoir is one of the biggest reasons we know her today, with the title Movers and Shakers.
Ah, yes.
Which covered her life from 1912 to 1917 and talked a lot about the bohemian art scene of New York during that time and her evenings, if you remember those.
Mm-hmm.
It again made waves for various reasons, namely this time for Mabel's description of her love affair with revolutionary John Reed, who had become something of a poster boy for labor leaders. But all press is good press, as you said earlier, as the old adage also goes, and Mabel had another hit on her hands. Pretty cool.
Man, I hope I have like a bunch of memoirs and novels in me.
Right? And you do.
So much time.
Yeah, we all do. Despite all of the drama that the three women had participated in previously with Lorenzo, Dorothy Brett, Frieda Lawrence, and Mabel all found themselves living in Taos and now getting along quite well, even finding that the three were a regular pair, talking and having get-togethers often. Hilariously, the Honorable Dorothy Brett never gave up her snooping ways and apparently had a telescope that she kept at her window and would spy on Mabel every chance she got.
The ear trumpet of the eye.
The ear trumpet of the eye. Oh my God, that's great. In 1937, Mabel released her final memoir entitled Edge of Taos Desert, and though this seemed to be the least critically popular of her books, many at the time said, and many do still say, that it was her finest work. By this time, though, she had found that she had more or less caught up with herself in her writing. She had pretty much written and published her entire life story up to now. Life seemed to slow down a bit finally, as Mabel was now 58. She continued to journal and bring artists to Taos, hosting them and trying to inspire them. Around this time, her old friend John Collier was finally made the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and was actually taking action. He fired the previous governor of the Taos Pueblo, and upon doing so, received a telegram from Mabel that simply read, "Whole Pueblo relieved." Which I just love. I think
do
is so
love that.
Cool. Like always, Mabel tried to take advantage of her friend's talent and was now constantly hounding John Collier for policy change, sometimes good, sometimes bad. As a whole, John Collier described Mabel's policy change suggestions by saying, quote, "We should have chaos in short order if we planned Mrs. Luhan to dictate policies."
Hey, but she was well intended.
She tried, and we earlier today when we were at the Pueblo, as we were talking to some of the people that actually lived there, I was curious and I asked. I just said, "Hey, can I ask you honestly, what are the feelings about Mabel and what she did for tribal whatever, like progress,
and
you know?"
Was,
and
yeah.
they said, they were like, "Well, you know, it's not without a little bit of mixed reviews, but generally
mostly good.
We like her. Yeah, she did a lot of stuff. She helped us get a lot of land back and that we didn't have before. The government was trying to take it all away." So again, I think it's really cool. She really was trying, even though, as John Collier said, maybe some of her policies were crazy. She I think was just
also,
doing everything she could to
that
help
could be taken
them.
with a grain of salt because maybe her policies weren't crazy, but
That's
he
true.
saw them as crazy, and
Absolutely
she
true.
got done what she got done.
Absolutely true. Very, very fair. Over the coming years, there would be many examples, again, sometimes good, sometimes bad, of Mabel meddling in tribal affairs. I do think, for the most part, her heart was in the right place. In 1947, Mabel published her last book entitled Taos and Its Artists, which was a collection of essays, biographies, and portraits of artists she had hosted over the years, as well as samples of their work. She went back to New York around this time, rented a large apartment, and caused quite a little bit of buzz after announcing she would start back up her evenings. But this quickly went south, as all of the new generation guests that she invited kept to themselves and mostly made a mockery of the whole event. Mabel had now arrived at the phase that every person, with the exception of Jeff Goldblum, arrives at, and said that the new generation had no brains and no manners. Jeff
With
Goldblum
the
is the only one.
of Jeff Goldblum.
He is the only one that is perpetually 17. I don't know how he does it.
I love him so much.
Who doesn't? He's Jeff Goldblum. He's the best. Life went on back in Taos with Tony, always faithful to her and by her side. Despite their vast differences and limited ability to communicate, Mabel always said they understood one another well enough and loved each other's company. A few weeks before the age of 65, Mabel gave an interview to Santa Fe magazine, and when asked how she felt at age 65, Mabel replied, quote, "Just the way I've always felt. No different. One doesn't feel any different. That's the strange thing about life." Almost like tearing up hearing that, you know? After several strokes in the late 1950s that left her in the hospital for several extended stays, John Evans and Claire Spencer moved back to Taos to be with her. Mabel Dodge Luhan died on August 13th, 1962, at the age of 83 from coronary thrombosis. She was buried in Kit Carson Park, which is located just a few blocks away from the town center of Taos, in a small cemetery with a closed casket. Her headstone, a simple slab of marble, and a little bit of kind of, I would say, brown stone to keep it upright. Very, very humble, right? About 2 feet high. And to me, it's a true reflection of who she had become in her later years. If you think about where she came from in Buffalo, you'd imagine she would have a 17-foot high...
A baronial.
Yeah, baronial engraved stone that was imported from... And now here we are. And how would you... Talk to me about her grave yesterday.
It was just very like... It was not the biggest or the shiniest or anything. There was definitely... People had put stuff there.
Yeah.
There were decorations and, just like little ornaments and flower type things. And wasn't there an egg? I don't even know.
There was an egg.
There was some odd stuff, but
somebody left a pen, which I thought was really cool.
It was a very small headstone.
Very humble, in the corner of the graveyard.
In the very corner. There was one headstone to the left.
Yep.
And it was in the very corner of the graveyard. And it was actually interesting because right now there's some construction and there were some like temporary fences. So like right behind it, it was it was like if the fence of the graveyard wasn't there, then you almost, it almost could be lost.
So, and it's fun little fact too, is literally right behind her grave. Taos has erected a huge stage. Kat and I, as we told you the other day, have personally gone to, I think, 2 or 3 concerts there. One, we saw Sting, which was amazing. Another one, we saw My Morning Jacket. Her parents said they saw the Alabama Shakes. And all of this was rocking out. And I'm not kidding you, Mabel was... 20 feet away?
Yeah, it's right there.
And to me, I don't know, after learning so much about her and what she was after and her whole notion of bringing great souls to Taos, there's something about it that's just so romantic.
Great
and that
souls
it's
have
like,
come to Taos.
they're still coming.
I'm getting choked up.
They're still coming, right? They're still coming to perform and they're still doing things. And she still gets to be a part of it.
I know. Stop.
It's so cool, right?
It is a good thing this is audio, not video.
Oh, you
can
are
see my
tearing
teary
up. I love
eyes.
it. In the days leading up to her burial, Tony was overwhelmed with grief, mostly staring off in a daze, even when company was around, but would occasionally pop up out of nowhere and ask the closest person, "Where's Mabel?" Which I'm already getting emotional thinking about. Just before the funeral was about to begin, Tony looked around and said, "We can't start without Mabel."
Oh my gosh. Daniel, you didn't give me a heads up.
I seriously am getting choked up because it's like, I can't imagine that feeling, man. Okay. Because John Evans and Claire Spencer were trying to sort out of the legality regarding inheritance and property following Mabel's death, they moved Tony out of the house he and Mabel had been living in, known as the Big House, and into one of her many other properties. About 6 months after Mabel passed, Tony got up in the middle of the night, probably to use the bathroom and probably forgetting where he was, fell down the stairs and died on January 27th, 1963. Years after her death, in 1970, her house, Los Gallos, where we currently are right now, was actually purchased by actor Dennis Hopper of Easy Rider fame, amongst many other films, obviously. Dennis Hopper would live in Mabel's house for the next 20 years, calling it the Mud Palace, even spending years of seclusion at times, cooped up in the house, and even turning it into something of a hippie commune at one point. This led to locals treating the hippies with hostility, which ultimately led Dennis Hopper to stationing armed gunmen on the roof of Los Gallos, which then led to his arrest in 1975 for gun possession and resisting arrest.
Okay. I'm like looking at the roof, looking at the
literally
roof right
looking
here.
at the roof, and they are literally, that's where they would be standing and holding like AK-47s and stuff. As per Dennis Hopper's request. During Hopper's time at Los Gallos, he would attract the likes of Jack Nicholson, Joni Mitchell, Bo Diddley, and Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Once again, Mabel bringing great souls to Taos. Hopper even married Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas in the solarium of Los Gallos.
In this room.
In the very room that you and I are in right now. Which is where, again, my wife and I are going to stay tonight. To note, Michelle Phillips divorced Hopper just 1 week later.
Well, you're already married, so it's probably fine.
Now, I will say, there were many, many more stories that we could have told throughout Mabel's life. Many more details about the things she did and accomplished. Many more people she interacted with and drew to Taos, and many more pieces of her story that we simply didn't have time to cover. But it's here that we will end the story of Mabel Dodge Luhan. A person that, for me, has proven to be a great example of never stopping, never being afraid to try again or try something new, always searching for meaning and purpose in the life she was given, always evolving, far from perfect, but never boring. She changed the American Southwest forever, especially art being produced within it, and preserved through those artists and their art, the native people of the land. Though she herself might not have been a prodigious figure of art or politics like a D.H. Lawrence, Gertrude Stein, John Reed, Isadora Duncan, Georgia O'Keeffe, Ansel Adams, or John Collier, Mabel was a perfect example of a personal achievement, not necessarily by her own creativity or accomplishments, but by being a mover and a shaker.
I'm just going to tear up a little bit. I'm still feeling sad about Mabel and Tony, but wow.
I know. It's also, I'll be honest with you, when I finished writing this whole thing, which for everybody out there, let me see, actually. I hit 55 pages of writing for this, which is officially the most I've ever written on any single subject in my entire existence. And I'm going to continue on with this for many more series. But when I finished writing this, I definitely had a little 2-minute tear up session because it honestly felt like I was saying goodbye to a good friend.
Kind of reminds me of, did you ever do theater?
Oh, yeah.
Like, you know, when you would do the show and then it would be the last night and there would be the cast party and it was like the show was a wrap.
And it was also, I feel like the last night of the performance was when usually if you were in high school or something, your drama teacher would come out, and that's when the students would give the teacher the flowers. Mm-hmm. And that was for me always the most we're all sitting over here taking bows, but we wouldn't have been doing this if it wasn't for the teacher that's doing it or whatever. So that's basically exactly how I felt about this. It's I wouldn't be doing this entire series if it wasn't for this person's amazing life. Plain and simple.
Yep.
You know?
And here we are in her house.
Still talking about her.
Beautiful house.
Yeah. Still talking about her however many 80 some odd years after she passed, plus, I think, at this point. It's pretty wild.
It's pretty wild. Also, you just made me remember that it's been 80 years since 1950 something.
Was 63 was when she died?
63.
I think.
Okay.
62, 63.
But still, it's
62.
So just, revealing my age, something the 60s seems like 20, 30 years ago. I forget.
60 some odd years ago, whatever. Well, anyhow, I suppose we'll wrap it up from here. I don't know how long this episode is going to end up being with all of our banter and this extra long script, but I suppose I'll say to everybody out there, thanks for listening. We're going to have many more series to come. Aubrey's up next. Again, I won't spoil who it's going to be just yet. I think you'll just know when the episode drops. But stay tuned for our next series. And then once Aubrey does her series, which I'm assuming will be probably a pretty similar length, 4 to 5 episodes, if not 5 or 6 episodes.
That's the plan.
And then it'll go back to me and we're going to keep going from there. So, yeah, again, I would just say for anybody that has made it through this series, can't tell you honestly how much it means to me that you've listened and hopefully you've enjoyed and learned. Once again, though, if anybody has corrections or things to update, shoot us an email at thebiograperspodcast@gmail.com. Anything else, Aubrey?
No, I'm just excited to be here. Thank you for telling me that story. And
of course. What'd you think?
It's just a remarkable life,
isn't it?
And a reminder that, people are capable of so many things, and a life is long.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not, but there's so many things that happen. It's just really interesting to, deep dive into somebody's existence and all the different things. And we're so fortunate that she was so prolific in her writing and did all the things. And
agreed.
Yeah, but it was interesting, and hopefully I'll be interesting. My topic is my topic's a little more of a well-known person. Yeah, I think
that's for anybody out there that's wondering. We're definitely not sticking to just obscure characters of history. We're jumping around all over the place.
Yeah, it's gonna be just whoever seems to pique our interest.
Mm-hmm.
But oddly enough, we're already finding connections between these people.
We are.
So.
And
unintended connections.
I will also say with Mabel, one of the reasons I enjoy her story so much. Can I just say that in our modern times, where it seems like you can't make a mistake ever, because somebody can always look back on Twitter 10, 15 years ago and see that you did something bad. And I'm not picking on anybody in particular. I'm off of Twitter, so please. I've never been on it ever, so I have no history on Twitter. So all I'm trying to say is that it hurts a lot of times when you see people use somebody's past mistakes against them. And I love going through Mabel's life because it is this example of how, man, you are gonna be making a lot of mistakes along the way, but you cannot let it define you.
Oh, yeah.
And you can always move forward from those mistakes that you've made if you recognize them and you turn around. I particularly think of that story with Bindo Medici, of obviously a terrible story. Obviously she feels bad about it and did for her whole life. And as a result became an advocate for gay rights moving forward. And for any person that was gay moving forward, she didn't care at all and was actively friends. Spud Johnson lived here in this house for, I think 30 or 40 years with her and was one of her best friends. And I think her assistant. So again, it's just one of these examples of you can always be changing. You can always be growing. You can always be looking at these mistakes that you've made, and you can choose to be better from it, So I don't know. I just think these stories of people through history, we're not told about their mistakes a lot of times unless their story is the mistake. And I don't like that.
That's a really good point.
So I hope that through us doing this podcast and all these other series, this can continue to be illuminated, that we can continue to see people that have made a lot of mistakes, but have also continued to pursue goodness, ultimately at the end of it. I don't know. I personally, I just connect with that a lot, and that's kind of my goal for this entire thing. So,
okay.
Well, anyways, let's let everybody get out of here. Again, thanks for listening, and Aubrey, thanks for coming on down here to Taos too, so we can do this extra spatial episode.
Thanks for suggesting it. Now I'm going out for an anniversary dinner.
Yeah, you are. It's gonna be good. Super fun.
Super fun.
All right, everyone. Well, we will see you next time. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Biographers. For more information, please visit thebiographerspodcast.com.